Matthew chapter 5. We'll be focusing on verses 21 through 26 in just a moment. But if I were to ask you, have you murdered anybody? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand because if you're sitting next to someone who did, it might make you a little nervous. But this morning, Jesus is going to tell us something about murder that's going to shock every single one of us. Up until now, Jesus has been very general as we've been making our way through the Sermon on the Mount. But now he's going to start getting specific. Jesus will begin illustrating that what's on the inside is a lot more important than what's on the outside of you. It's what's on the inside that counts. It's not just actions, but attitude. It's not just methods, but motives. It's not just practices, but purposes. It's not just conduct, but character. And he's going to talk about murder and anger and adultery and divorce and honesty and revenge and loving your enemies. And what he's going to say is not only going to astound the common people listening to him, but it's going to greatly anger the Pharisees who are also listening. The Pharisees are just like the average person in the world today. They believe that righteousness begins and ends on the outside. It's what you do that makes a righteous person. If you just pay your taxes, you're good to your family, go to church, deal honesty with your neighbor, then you're righteous. But Jesus said, not so. True righteousness does not begin on the outside, but on the inside of a person. Righteous is not what you do, but what you are. 6 times in the next several verses over the next few weeks, Jesus is going to quote from the law or from the interpretation of the law given by the Pharisees. For example, in verse 21, he says, you have heard. In verse 31, he'll say, it's been said. And he will say that over and over. And then he's going to dynamite the religious gurus and the who's who of the day by saying, but I say. But I say. Now, there are some who claim that Jesus is contradicting the Old Testament, but they're wrong. For Jesus is not contradicting the Old Testament in what it said, but what the Pharisees and the scribes said that it taught. Jesus was not denying the Old Testament, he was deepening the law. And the first situation he deals with is murder. Look at verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. Murder in the first degree is what Jesus is dealing with. The first crime ever recorded in the Bible was murder. Not the first sin, but the first social result of sin was murder when Cain chose to kill his brother Abel. And we are still reaping the results of that first crime. I read somewhere some time ago where there are some 25,000 known murders that take place every year, 70 every day, 3 every hour. And that doesn't include abortions. That doesn't include suicide. We are now the murder capital of the Western world. But if you were to go out on the streets of Louisville and ask, have you ever murdered anyone? The vast majority of people would give you an emphatic no. But Jesus is going to say, not so fast, my friend. Murder is not primarily an act. Murder is primarily an attitude. And Jesus is going to show us that probably every one of us has been guilty at one time or another of having the seed of murder in our heart. Jesus is going to teach us that you can have the seed of murder in your heart whether you ever sow it and reap the results or not. If you remember, for example, the prodigal son who wished his father was dead so he could have his inheritance. Because in Bible days, you couldn't get your inheritance until your father was dead. So that's what the prodigal son was wanting, his father's inheritance. Was he a murderer? Jesus would not say, or would say not with his hand, but with his heart he was. So you're going to find that the fruit of murder is found in the root of anger. So I want you to listen. Jesus has 3 things to say, beginning in verse 21, about murder in the first degree. First of all, he says, you had better seriously perceive anger before you. You had better seriously perceive anger before you. Look at verses 21 and 22. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, people then, as today, thought murder was nothing more than a physical act. If I unlawfully and physically take the life of another human being, then I am guilty of murder. However, Jesus says, but I say unto you that you can be a murderer in your heart without ever being a murderer with your hands. That there's more to murder than just a physical act. Suppose you wanted to kill somebody and you planned out exactly how you were going to do it, but at the last minute you changed your mind. Jesus would say you are guilty of the attitude of murder. Just because you didn't pull the trigger, that doesn't mean you are not a murderer. You are still guilty of the sinful attitude of murder. But Jesus says it goes even deeper than that. Because he says, but I say to you that in verse 22, that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. What's the anger Jesus is talking about there? Well, that's the anger you have, but no one else can see. You get angry, you just grit your teeth, but you say nothing at all. You get angry, you clench your fist, but you don't say a word. You get angry and fire is flashing from your eyes, but you say nothing. You could be so angry at someone you could just spit. You could be boiling on the inside and covered up on the outside. And Jesus says, watch it, you're guilty of the attitude of murder. And then he goes even deeper in verse 22, because then he says, whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And he's talking about those times when you get so angry that you say something that the minute you say it, you wish you hadn't have said it. Have you ever did that? Have you ever gotten so angry you said something you didn't mean to say, but you said it anyway? Have you ever let that poisonous venom come out of your mouth or profanity? And then Jesus says you're guilty of the attitude of murder. But then he goes on in verse 22 to say, whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Now you know that the Greek word for fool is what? Moron. Moron. We use that a lot around here because it's a biblical word. Now, that was a word used to refer to people who were considered morally wasted people. Jesus said that when you get to the point that you get so angry and you lose your temper and you call people and hurl insults, calling them trash, calling them worthless, calling them terrible names, then you are guilty of the attitude of murder. I don't care how mild-mannered you are. Most all of us have gotten so angry that we began to rant and rave, sulk and scream, and not caring who hears us or who we hurt. Jesus says you will be in danger of hell fire. Now let me just say, Jesus was not saying you would go to hell, but that you've hit the guilt level of hell. You are on the same level of a murderer. Jesus is trying to get us to understand just how destructive anger really is. You know, nowadays we have to deal with a phenomenon known as road rage. You've got to be careful today. If you cut someone off or they cut you off, it can lead to some serious trouble. I read not long ago about a true account of, in California, a woman by the name of Delfina Morales and her daughter were on a highway, and they got irritated because a lady in a van inadvertently cut them off. Mrs. Morales and her daughter got angry and began to tailgate the van and pull up beside the van and make obscene gestures to the woman in the van. Finally, the van got off the exit ramp, and Morales followed, trying to run the van off the exit ramp. And when she finally thought she had her revenge, she took off. And what the authorities later figured was that Mrs. Morales was so angry that she thought she was on an off-ramp when she was on an on-ramp, and she went straight into oncoming traffic, and she and her daughter were killed instantly. You see, anger is so dangerous. It can not only cause you to want to kill someone, but it can kill you too. And that's why Jesus said you'd better seriously perceive anger before you. And then we come to verse 23, and Jesus says you had better spiritually put anger behind you. You had better spiritually put anger behind you. Look at verse 23. So if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. In these two verses, Jesus is dealing with a situation that happens every Sunday. Right here, maybe. I would be shocked if there's not somebody here today and you've got something against somebody or somebody has something against you. Even as I've been preaching this message, God has maybe brought someone to your mind that you're on the outs with. Either they've done you wrong or you've done them wrong. You're bitter toward them or they're bitter toward you. Jesus said, if you know of anybody and they're not right with you and you're not right with them, then drop what you're doing, find that person, make things right, or else you cannot worship God. Did you know that's one of the few times in the Bible that we're told there's something more important than worship? And yet there's one thing more important than worship, and that is that you are in a right relationship with the people that you know. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, listen to what Paul had to say. He said, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Without anger or quarreling. Notice those two words, without anger. Paul said, don't try to come to church and worship God if you've got anger in your heart, because you can't worship God with anger in your heart. If you raise your hands, you're raising the hands of a hypocrite. If you're praying, it's the prayer of a hypocrite if you do those things with anger in your heart towards another person. So what's the point that both Jesus and Paul are making? You can't be right vertically if you're not right horizontally. You can't be right with God in heaven if you're not right with your brother or sister on earth. You cannot be right with God who is above you if you're not right with those who are beside you. And then Jesus says, in verses 25 and 26, you've got to sincerely place anger beyond you. You've got to sincerely place anger beyond you. Look at verse 25. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Now here's the point Jesus is making there. You not only better be right with your brother and sister, but with everyone you've ever had a relationship with. And you better make it right with everybody before it's too late. Here he's talking about someone who owed somebody else some money. And that's why he says what he does in verse 26. The Bible says that if you owed somebody money, they could lock you up if you couldn't pay your debts. No time limit on your punishment. But in debtor's prison, you couldn't make money to pay your debt. No work, no money, no debt paid, no get out of jail. It was a sentence of life without parole. And that's why Jesus says you better settle up quickly and quietly and finally before it goes to court, for there was no going back. Because you see, Roman law was very strict. Roman law said, if I owe you money, you can take me to court, or I could take you to court if you owe me money. And yet in Roman law, you could settle anywhere before going into court. Suppose you and I were walking to court anywhere, even the steps to the courthouse, you could settle up. But according to Roman law, if you ever stepped into a Roman courtroom, your future would be settled by a judge. So Jesus is illustrating a truth. Jesus is saying that it is so sad for two people to be on the outs or bitter toward one another and then even die without making things right. There are some of you who are struggling with this message because you're not right with a parent, a sibling, a child, a neighbor, a relative, a friend, a coworker, a colleague. Jesus says before it's too late and someone takes their final breath, make things right. Settle that case out of court. How many of you remember the Portrait of the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci? You've probably seen that somewhere over time. When he was painting that picture, he had a bitter falling out with a painter friend of his, and it was really bad. He had done something wrong to Da Vinci, and Da Vinci was trying to figure out how to get him back. And so Da Vinci devised a plan that when he painted the face of Judas Iscariot, he would paint the face of his friend who had hurt him. And that's what he did. Da Vinci was getting so much pleasure out of this that he had stuck it to his friend, and that went well until he painted the last face of the portrait, the face of Jesus. Da Vinci said that when he came to the face of Jesus, something happened that had never happened before. He drew a blank. He couldn't paint anything. He could see every other face clearly except the face of Jesus. One day he said God convicted him of his anger and unforgiveness. And God said to him, "Leonardo, you will never see the face of my son until you make things right with your brother." And Leonardo dropped his brush, ran out of the room, found his friend, begged for forgiveness, and reconciled. He returned to the portrait, took the face off of Judas, painted a generic face instead, and he said at that moment the image of the face of Jesus became instantly crystal clear because he had made things right with his brother. So just think about it. Have you ever murdered anybody? No, probably, of course not. But Jesus says, not so fast. You're guilty of murder in the first degree, if for nothing else, for nailing him to the cross. And if the perfect Son of God can forgive you and me for murdering him, how much should we forgive others, no matter what they do to us? Amen? Amen.